The bright lights of Manhattan, all that glitz and ambition, always seemed to bend the knee to Amelia Vance. She practically owned the skyline with her company, Vance Global Investments. It was proof of how smart and totally ruthless she was. She just knew she could never lose. For 48 years, she had been a major player in high finance, a total powerhouse in her expensive suits, her sharp blonde haircut, and a stare that never wavered as she made her billions. Control was her thing, and she truly believed she was untouchable. Just yesterday, she was about to buy another huge infrastructure company, ready to make her empire even bigger. Bob Henderson, her senior partner, the guy she always knew was loyal, even gave her a real smile, a silent nod to her genius. Everything felt perfect and rock solid, but the stock market is a cruel, unpredictable monster that doesn't care about anyone's success. Today, the perfect world Amelia had built was disappearing like smoke. Blinking red warnings were screaming on her private computer screen. CNBC was shouting headlines about the market crashing, selling off, and record losses. Her phone, usually her main link to power, felt incredibly heavy. Vance Global was losing money fast. Her carefully built company was falling apart because of an unexpected economic shock that specifically hit her main investments. It wasn't just a bad day for the market. It felt like a direct, personal attack. She watched the numbers, millions vanishing with every nervous breath, a heavy, scary feeling of hopelessness sinking in. She had promised herself she would never feel this weak again, not since she was a kid and her family lost everything in a brutal crash, leaving them broke and ashamed. Now, she was back here, her stomach twisting with that familiar, sick feeling of being powerless. She slammed her hand down on the cool, shiny wood of her desk, a small, pointless protest against a hidden enemy. No way. This couldn't be happening. She ripped off her unique, heavy watch, a gift from the old mentor who taught her that being emotional was weak and money was protection, and carelessly tossed it on the desk. It made a quiet clink, the only sound in the huge, silent office. The hours blurred, night turning into that gray time before dawn. The office building, which was usually buzzing with energy, was creepy and quiet, except for the low hum of the air conditioning. Amelia, still slumped in her chair, just stared at the monitors, which now just mirrored the emptiness inside her. She hadn't left. She couldn't. This sparkly skyscraper, her monument to being invincible, now felt like a glass cage. She felt completely, terrifyingly alone. That's when she heard it, the soft squeak of wheels, a faint, repeating swish. David Miller, the night janitor. To Amelia, he was practically a ghost, just part of the building she never noticed. He walked the empty hallways, pushing his old cart, a silent guard in her empire. David was 46, his eyes tired but sharp, missing nothing. He'd been cleaning these floors for 7 years, a constant, invisible presence. Tonight, the heavy silence of the usually busy office felt different. He saw the red lights still flashing on Amelia Vance's screens, a sharp contrast to the peaceful blue of a system that was shut down. He saw her slumped figure, a rare look into the private sadness of the woman who owned this whole world. David had seen a lot as a janitor over the years, read a lot in the thrown-out papers, and heard a lot in the hushed voices of late-night meetings. He knew Amelia worked late, knew her routine, how she liked her blinds, and the special fancy tea she drank. He also knew the deep, lonely quiet that often comes with being super rich. He stopped, looking at the discarded finance papers and the watch on her desk. He'd seen that watch hundreds of times. What had happened? Could a woman with so much power really be brought down? He kept up his routine, carefully wiping the glass walls, emptying the trash cans, moving efficiently and expertly. He came closer to her office, cleaning the edges of the room. He knew she hadn't eaten, probably hadn't moved in hours. He thought of his own daughter, Olivia, sleeping soundly in their small apartment in Queens, of the simple notes they left for each other, the little loving things that held their lives together. He remembered his wife, gone too soon, a memory that still sometimes made him choke up. He had left the stressful construction world, where he was a foreman, to make sure he was always there for Olivia. Now, he was here, seeing this woman, this giant of a person, turned into a hollow shell. He paused. Then, grabbing an extra thermos he'd filled with hot, soothing chamomile tea, He quietly stepped into her office. He placed it gently on the corner of a side table, where she wouldn't immediately see it but could easily reach it. He didn't say anything. He didn't want to shock her, didn't want her to feel exposed in her complete defeat. He simply left the silent gift and kept working, disappearing back into the shadows of the silent skyscraper. He finished his shift just as the first weak light of dawn appeared. He left the building, the cool morning air a sharp change from the stale air of Amelia's despair. His daughter, Olivia, bright-eyed despite the early hour, was waiting for him at their usual bus stop, holding her well-used sketchpad. He smiled, the quiet tiredness in his eyes softening. What would a powerful woman do when everything she knew collapsed, and the only help came from someone she had never even noticed? Amelia stirred, a dull headache pounding behind her eyes. The first cold, uncaring rays of sun shot through the glass, lighting up the disaster on her screens. She saw the thermos, a thin wisp of steam rising on the side table. Chamomile, her favorite. Who? She looked around the empty office, a flash of confused curiosity cutting through her misery. Was it one of her assistants? No, they were all gone. She picked it up, the warmth sinking into her cold hands. A small gesture, totally unexpected, in a world that had suddenly become brutally logical. She took a slow sip. The tea was comforting, a simple kindness she hadn't looked for and certainly hadn't asked for. The next day turned into a week of trying to fix things and desperate phone calls. Amelia's once solid confidence was cracked. Board members, usually polite, were now quietly talking about her leadership, about the unexpected flaws. Bob Henderson, ever the politician, offered his public support, but his eyes, Amelia noticed, held a strange, almost hidden flash. He suggested a new direction, playing it safer. It felt like a trap closing in. She was fighting for her career, digging through data, questioning her tech team, trying to figure out where the market's sudden, precise attack on her main infrastructure investments came from. The answers were hard to find, complicated, buried under layers of complex math and market changes. Late that week, she was still in her office, long after everyone else had run away from the worsening situation. She needed a clear head, needed to find a mistake, one thing she could fix. She heard the familiar squeak of the cleaning cart. David! She waited for him, a strange feeling of nervousness fluttering in her chest. He appeared in her doorway, his quiet presence almost surprising in the huge office. He started to clean, not looking at her. The tea, she began, her voice rough. That was you, right? David stopped, rag in hand. He looked up, his eyes meeting hers, calm and steady. Just looked like you needed it, Miss Vance. She felt an unexpected warmth inside, a quick moment of something like shame for her helplessness. You saw the screens then? It wasn't really a question. He nodded. Hard to miss. Big mess. Looks like a problem with the whole system. He moved to empty her trash, then stopped again. Funny thing though, I've been in this building for years, walk these halls every night, and I notice stuff. Little stuff. Like how the main power grid downstairs has been making a weird noise lately, more of a shudder, like it's struggling. He shrugged. Just something I noticed. Amelia laughed. A dry, humorless sound. A shudder? David, this is a multi-billion-dollar market crash. It's not a broken fuse. She waved him away. He was just a janitor. What could he possibly know about the complicated world of global finance? David didn't react. He simply met her gaze, a quiet certainty in his eyes that made her uncomfortable. You'd be surprised, Miss Vance, how much of what you call global finance still needs good old electricity, pipes, and concrete to run. It's all connected. You build a house, you need a strong foundation. You ignore that, well, the roof eventually falls in, no matter how nice the tiles are. He paused, then added, I used to be a construction foreman, actually. Before, life took me elsewhere. So, I know a thing or two about foundations and shaking buildings. He gave a small, barely noticeable nod. Just a thought. Amelia froze. A construction foreman? The man who emptied her trash, who she literally didn't even see most days, had just spoken with a calm confidence about the actual structure of the building. And he was suggesting that her huge, market-driven disaster might come from something so basic. It was ridiculous. It was offensive. But then, A terrifying thought poked at her. What if he wasn't wrong? What if her empire, like so many before, had overlooked the very ground it was built on? The market explanation, while complicated, felt incomplete, almost too perfect. If David was right, if there was a physical weakness, it could explain why the crash had been so targeted, so devastating. Her pride screamed at her to shut him down, to send him back to his cleaning. But desperation was eating at her. Her company was bleeding cash. Her career was hanging by a thread. What did she have left to lose? She looked at the abandoned watch on her desk. Her mentor's voice came back to her. Always look for the hidden advantage, Amelia. Always. Fine, she said, the word tasting bitter. After hours, you can look into your shutter. But if you find nothing, this stays between us. And if you say a word about it, you're fired. It was a desperate risk, something she never would have considered a week ago. Her face was tense, but David saw the slight shaking in her hands. He simply nodded, a quiet promise. Understood, Miss Vance, I won't let you down. He didn't smile, didn't look smug, just a calm acceptance of the job. He understood trust, especially when it was given so unwillingly. He thought of Olivia, of the quiet strength in her eyes, how she drew the world not as people told her to see it, but as it really was. He gathered his supplies, the faint squeak of his cart echoing in the suddenly heavy silence of the office. Amelia, alone again, stared at the retreating blue uniform. Was she truly so desperate that she was putting the fate of her company in the hands of a janitor? What other truths had she completely missed in her single-minded chase for power? Maybe the biggest dangers always come from the places you never bother to look. The faint glow of the city lights outside her window seemed to mock her, reminding her of the millions of small details she failed to see. The deep hum of the main server room, usually a steady, comforting drone, felt wrong tonight. David moved carefully through the maze-like basement of the Vance Global building, his flashlight cutting through the darkness, lighting up dust particles floating in the cold air. The building's huge network of pipes, wires, and support beams was familiar territory, a forgotten world beneath the shiny elegance of Amelia's empire. He was looking for the shudder, that small, wrong note in the building's constant sound he'd noticed for weeks, maybe months. He knew this building better than anyone, every squeak, every groan, every hidden panel. He knew the specific weight of the heavy doors, the faint, metallic smell of the old air conditioning. He found the source, a set of backup cooling units, vital for the crowded servers Amelia had installed for her latest, failed infrastructure project. There was a weird discoloration on a support beam nearby, a small but clear sign of rust and rot inside. Not obvious, not dramatic, but to an experienced eye, it was a slow, growing problem, a structural disease that could eventually lead to total failure. He remembered the reports he'd filed, noting these small issues, only to have them dismissed by the building managers. It had always been about saving money, about quick fixes, about ignoring the deeper, more costly problems. This wasn't just a maintenance issue. This was a basic structural flaw, directly affecting the very core of Amelia's most important project, the project that had just crushed her entire company. The market hadn't just attacked, it had found a specific physical weakness. The next morning, David showed Amelia what he found. He laid out diagrams, pointed to the faint discoloration in digital photos he'd taken in the basement. "It's a specific kind of metal, Miss Vance," he explained, his voice quiet but firm. "They cut corners on the cooling system supports for that new data center. It's rusting faster than it should be, causing small, repeated power drops, straining the whole grid. It's a systemic weakness that would have been ignored until it failed completely." Amelia stared at the evidence, her face shocked and disbelieving. "Rust? You're telling me my multi-billion-dollar project, the one that's going to change infrastructure investment, is collapsing because of bad piping?" Her voice got louder, filled with anger and disbelief. This couldn't be it. This was too ordinary, too simple, too physical asterisk. Her empire was built on data, complex math, and market strategy, not on whether a metal beam was strong enough. This wasn't the kind of enemy she understood. She was a titan of finance, not a builder. To admit this meant admitting a huge weakness, a major mistake at the heart of her perfectly planned business. It shook her to the core. It was a shame, a raw admission of her own blindness, far worse than any money she lost. Later that afternoon, David walked down the busy streets of Queens, his mind still playing back Amelia's dismissive tone. He hated that feeling, that sting of being ignored, of being seen as nobody. He shook the feeling off as he saw Olivia waving excitedly from the school gates. She ran into his arms, clutching her old sketch pad tight. "Daddy, look!" she beamed, her eyes bright. She opened the pad to a detailed pencil drawing of a building, clearly the Vance Global Tower. But it wasn't just the front. She had sketched the decorations, the complicated patterns around the base, and even a faint, almost invisible detail on a lower support column that looked exactly like the discolored area David had photographed. "My teacher said we should draw the beauty in things people usually ignore, and your building has so many secret patterns." David's breath caught. Olivia, with her innocent eye for details people miss, had drawn the very thing Amelia had laughed at, but from a different angle. His daughter, barely a teenager, saw the truth in what the experts overlooked. Back at the office, Amelia was still dealing with David's discovery. Her phone buzzed. Bob Henderson was at her door. "Amelia," he began, his voice smoothly concerned. "The board is getting nervous. They need a clear action plan. We can't get distracted." He saw David, who had just come out of Amelia's private bathroom, wiping the counter. Bob's eyes narrowed slightly, a hint of disrespect. "Are you still wasting time with maintenance reports, Amelia? With all due respect, this is a financial crisis. It needs financial solutions, not plumbing checks." He gave David a look of dismissal, as if David was an annoyance, a dirty smudge on the perfect corporate image. David felt the familiar sting. It was always like this. His expertise, his knowledge of how the real world worked, was always treated as unimportant by those who dealt with abstract numbers. He watched Amelia, her face a battle between doubt and stubborn pride. He saw her about to wave him away, to once again choose the abstract over the real. It was too much. "Funny," David muttered under his breath, just loud enough for Amelia to hear. He wasn't looking at her, but at Bob, his eyes holding a quiet intensity. "I've got it all written down, you know. Every small issue, every report filed, dates, times, even who signed off on ignoring them. It's all in my *** building diary ***. He stressed the last two words, a subtle challenge. He then turned suddenly and left, his movements sharp, unlike his usual quiet gliding. Amelia's eyes snapped to David's retreating back, then to Bob, whose friendly mask seemed to slip for a moment, showing a flash of something unreadable, before smoothing over again. "A building diary?" Bob chuckled, a forced, brittle sound. "Seriously, Amelia? Are we listening to the crazy talk of the night staff now?" Amelia didn't answer. She looked at Bob, then at the empty doorway where David had disappeared. Her gaze drifted to her mentor's watch, still sitting abandoned on her desk, its cold, hard gleam reflecting the harsh reality of her situation. She was at a turning point. Her whole life had been built on ignoring uncomfortable truths, pushing aside the human elements, trusting only in the cold logic of numbers. But numbers lied. They were just ideas. The shaking power grid, the rusting support beam, Olivia's simple, honest drawing. Those were physical facts. Was it possible that Bob, with his easy dismissal, knew more than he was letting on? What if the real flaw wasn't just in the building structure, but in the foundation of her trust? The questions swirled, upsetting and urgent. Amelia couldn't stop thinking about David, saying *** building diary, ***. That phrase hit her with a hard truth she had totally ignored. She spent the next few hours working like crazy, driven by a growing, horrible feeling of suspicion. Alone in the quiet office, she found the building management's old digital files. She searched for David Miller, for maintenance reports, for anything about the backup cooling units. What she found scared her to death. Not only were there records of David's detailed notes and repeated warnings about the rusty support structure and the struggling power grid, but every single one had been deliberately marked as not important or completely ignored. Many of these rejections had Bob Henderson's department's approval, usually claiming it was to save money. This wasn't just carelessness, it was a planned pattern. The realization felt like a punch to the gut. Bob hadn't just been ignoring David's warnings. He had been actively hiding them. The subtle, mean little smile she'd seen on his face. How easily he'd brushed David aside, it all made sense now. This wasn't just a faulty beam. This was deliberate, planned negligence. This wasn't a problem he didn't know about. It was a problem he had let get worse, creating the exact weakness that ruined her company. Amelia felt sick. She remembered Bob's advice during the crisis, his seemingly calm suggestion to cut our losses and change focus. It all felt like the perfect setup for a hostile takeover, a plan to make money off the very weakness he had allowed to become critical. The fear she felt was no longer just about saving her company. It was a colder, sharper fear of being betrayed. This was her trusted partner, her right-hand man, the guy she had promoted, now revealed as a snake in her own house. How could she have been so stupid? Her mentor's stern face popped into her mind. Asterisk, never trust anyone, Amelia, not truly. Asterisk. She had dismissed David because she thought he was beneath her. And now she realized that Bob, her supposed equal, had been systematically taking her down from the inside. The harsh reality of how alone she was weighed heavily on her. Who could she trust now? She thought about Olivia's drawing, how the child's innocent eyes saw the small flaws that Amelia's complicated systems had missed. She thought of David, a man whose expertise she had dismissed with a wave, but who had constantly given her uncomfortable truths. The watch on her desk seemed to mock her, a symbol of a ruthless ambition that had also made her completely blind. She wasn't just fighting a market crash anymore. She was fighting a deeply personal betrayal, one that came from the very culture she had helped build. What a terrible joke. She, who valued control above everything, had become a chess piece in someone else's game. Meanwhile, David's phone rang with a number he didn't know. A text message. It wasn't words, but a picture. A slightly blurry photo of a red backpack, definitely Olivia's, sitting on a bench outside her school. No words, just the image. His blood went cold. The threat was clear, and it was disgusting. His heart hammered in his chest, a raw, protective fear taking hold. He could face any number of corrupt bosses, but Olivia was everything to him, the only reason for every decision he'd ever made, every sacrifice. He immediately called her babysitter, a trusted neighbor, and told her to pick Olivia up right away, to stay inside, to tell no one. His quiet life, his carefully protected home for his daughter, was now under attack. The anger that surged was cold, sharp, and focused. This was no longer just about Amelia's company. It was about protecting his child from the poison of this empire. He had to stop this. He pulled out a small, old notepad from his pocket, a habit from his foreman days, and started writing. Not just the technical details, but something more. Something he hoped would break through Amelia's tough exterior. A message from one parent to another, from one person to another. The fate of his daughter, and maybe Amelia's entire company, depended on a single note, carefully folded, waiting to be delivered. The board meeting was just a couple of hours away. Amelia's internal shaking grew worse as she walked toward the big, shiny wooden doors of the boardroom. She gripped her old leather briefcase, which held a mix of damning proof from David's building diary and the desperate plea from his note. She looked at her reflection in the glass wall, a woman who looked calm on the outside, but was falling apart inside. She pulled off her mentor's watch, its weight suddenly too much to bear, and slipped it into her pocket. A small, symbolic act of fighting against the past that had made her. Inside, the air was thick with tension. Bob Henderson sat at the head of the table, his usual fake, cheerful look back in place, but with a slight, greedy glint in his eye. He caught her gaze, a faint, insulting smile on his lips, as if to say, "Asterisk, it's all over, Amelia. Asterisk." She walked past him, without even looking at him, taking her seat. The board chairman cleared his throat. "Amelia, we all need to know what you plan to do. Bob has presented a convincing plan for reorganization that includes a change in leadership." Amelia took a deep breath, her eyes sweeping over the faces of the board members. Some doubtful, Some resigned, all waiting for her to break. "Gentlemen," she began, her voice steady despite her hands trembling under the table, "I understand your worries, and I have indeed come with a plan." She paused, letting the silence hang, increasing the tension. "But first, I need to tell you what really times, happened to Vance Global. And it starts not with a market change, but with a rusty beam in our very own basement." She laid out David's detailed logbook, the photos, the recorded rejections, the approvals from Bob's department. She explained how the structural flaw in the backup cooling units, which was ignored, created the system instability that Bob then used to crash her main infrastructure investments, short-selling her own company into ruin. The board members leaned forward, their faces changing from doubt to growing horror. Bob, who was calm at first, started to sweat, his face turning pale. He tried to interrupt, to call it unsupported claims, but Amelia cut him off with a stare that could turn things to ice. She held up a large copy of Olivia's sketch, pointing out the barely visible detail that backed up David's observation from a child's point of view. Even a child could see the flaw, gentlemen, if they only looked. Then she talked about David's note. Not the actual paper note, but what it said. It detailed not only the technical fix, a specific, complicated engineering solution that would stabilize the power grid and stop future fluctuations, but also included a strong warning about the long-term dangers of choosing superficial cost-cutting over solid construction, and a subtle but deep plea to think about the human cost of her empire. It was a note not just about beams and wires, but about trust and blindness. As she spoke, Amelia looked straight at Bob. "Mr. Henderson," she stated, her voice cold and clear, "knew all of this. He not only ignored vital warnings but actively used them to plan a hostile takeover. This wasn't an unexpected market change. It was a planned betrayal." Bob exploded, shouting accusations, denying everything, trying to make David look bad, trying to turn the board against Amelia. He painted her as emotional, desperate, falling for the crazy theories of a complaining janitor. But Amelia, for the first time in her life, wasn't afraid of a fight. She had the facts, the evidence, and the undeniable truth of David's expertise, combined with her own admission of a huge mistake. The board, faced with clear proof and the risk of a massive scandal if this went public, quickly voted. Bob was fired immediately, his access cut before he could even gather his things. He stormed out, his face a mask of bitter anger, but without his carefully built leverage, he was powerless. Amelia looked out the window, watching the city lights turn on. The company was saved, but at a huge personal cost. Her trust was broken, her whole view of the world forever changed. She had faced her deepest fear, not just losing money, but being morally blind. She called David, "Mr. Miller," she said, her voice softer than he'd ever heard it. "You saved my company, and you taught me a lesson I really needed to learn." David, for his part, was just relieved. The threat to Olivia was gone. He and Olivia shared a quiet dinner, just the two of them. He told her about the note, about Amelia's choice. Olivia, who was wise for her age, simply hugged him tightly. "You're the best, Daddy," she whispered. That was all the reward he needed. In the weeks and months that followed, Vance Global Investments completely changed. Amelia, humbled by what happened, kept her promise. She started a new physical infrastructure and human oversight department, putting David Miller in charge. His building diary became required reading for new project managers. She also started a groundbreaking Second Chances program, recognizing that talent and integrity often came from unexpected places. The firm, once a cold fortress of ambition, started to build a reputation for ethical practices, for valuing its people as much as its profits. Amelia even started volunteering at the local community center, where Olivia took art classes, slowly, tentatively, reconnecting with a world beyond the boardroom. The Vance Global building, once a monument to Amelia's singular ambition, now had a different energy. It was still gleaming, still a beacon in the skyline, but now it had visible signs of its new culture. A small, simple plaque near the entrance read, "The David Miller Center for Foundational Integrity." On a lower rooftop, what was once wasted space now bloomed into a vibrant community garden for employees. Olivia's artwork, celebrating hidden beauty, decorated the walls of the newly designed employee lounges. Years later, Amelia Vance and David Miller stood on that very rooftop, watching the sunset paint the Manhattan skyline in shades of orange and purple. David, no longer in a janitor's uniform, but in a nice, comfortable suit, had become a respected leader, a mentor to many, easily balancing his demanding job with his main priority, Olivia. Olivia, now a talented young artist, had her work proudly displayed in the Vance Global lobby, a subtle reminder of where true vision often came from. "You know," Amelia said, a genuine soft smile on her face, "I used to think miracles came from market shifts, from clever deals, from the sky." She looked at David, her gaze warm and sincere. "Now I know they come from people, from those who refuse to give up, who see what others don't, and who have the guts to speak the truth to power." David looked at her, his quiet, knowing eyes reflecting the city lights. "And you're the only miracle I'll ever need, Miss Vance." Olivia, running up to them with a new sketch in hand, giggled, her laughter ringing bright in the glowing city night. She threw her arms around her father, then reached for Amelia's hand, naturally pulling them closer together. For the first time in many years, the three of them felt something no amount of money could ever buy. They were seen, they were loved, and they belonged. And in that moment, Amelia knew with absolute certainty that this was the truest, most lasting empire she would ever build. What would you do if your world collapsed, and the quiet truth you needed to rebuild came from the most unexpected of places? Please leave a comment below. And don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel to get more stories like this. Till next time.